They called her project an eyesore, a violation. They fined her, tried to shut it down, but when the skies turned black and the winds howled, her forbidden hole in the ground became their only hope. You won't believe how one woman's defiance saved a community. Don't miss what happens next as a Florida town faces nature's fury and human folly. The letter, crisp and important in its stark white envelope, felt heavier than its single page. Notice of violation and fine on Grace Holloway, 39, a civil engineer with hands more accustomed to blueprints and soil compactors than trembling paper. Read the words again, the Florida sun warming her back, doing nothing to dispel the chill that settled deep in her bones. An unauthorized alteration to landscape, detrimental to the aesthetic harmony of the community. 500 are fine, and a further 100 per day until remedied. Remedied. They meant demolished. Her gaze drifted from the offensive paper to the gentle slope of her backyard in the Palm Point subdivision of Fort Myers. Beneath a carefully disguised hatch, nestled amongst a new planting of hardy, native shrubs, lay the reason for the HOA's ire, a subterranean storm shelter, dug and fortified over 3 painstaking months. It wasn't a whim, it was a response to the increasingly volatile hurricane seasons, to the memory of Hurricane Charlie that had sideswiped the coast years ago but left an indelible mark on Floridians' psyches, and to the gnawing fear that, as a widow with 2 young children, Lily, 10, and Tom, 8, she was their sole protector. The 2016 hurricane season was already predicted to be an active one. The idea had taken root the previous year, after a particularly nasty summer squall had sent them scurrying to the innermost bathroom, the winds howling like tormented spirits. Lily had been terrified. Tom stoic but pale. Grace had vowed then, no more. Fort Myers, for all its sunshine and swaying palms, sat squarely in the path of potential devastation. Public shelters were an option, sure, Dawn, but the thought of navigating overwhelmed roads with 2 frightened children, uncertain of finding space, was a nightmare in itself. Her engineering background gave her the knowledge. Her late husband Mark's life insurance, a modest sum carefully managed, provided the means. Aesthetic harmony, she muttered, the phrase leaving a bitter taste. Palm Pointe, with its uniform beige houses and meticulously manicured lawns, was a testament to Douglas Hart's vision of order. Hart, the 54-year-old HOA president, a retired orthodontist with a grip on the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, pushed CC&Rs tighter than any retainer he'd ever fitted. He was a man who believed conformity equaled value, and deviation was an affront. He'd made his displeasure known from the moment the first load of excavated earth had been discreetly hauled away. An underground bunker, Mrs. Holloway? He'd queried, his voice smooth but edged with disapproval. During one of his neighborhood patrols, he'd peered at the initial dig site, his arms crossed, his polo shirt pristine. Not exactly in keeping with Palm Pointe's ambiance, is it? Grace had tried to reason with him. Mr. Hart, it's a storm shelter. For safety, it will be completely hidden once the landscaping is done. It's for the community, a place for us and our immediate neighbors if the worst happens. She'd even shown him the plans, FEMA compliant, reinforced concrete, proper ventilation, a miniature fortress. Hart remained unmoved. Our community guidelines are quite clear on unauthorized structures and significant landscape alterations. There are designated public shelters. This project sets a precedent. What if everyone decided to dig up their yards? What if a Category 4 decides to pay a visit? Grace had retorted, her patience thinning. Aesthetic harmony won't matter much then, will it? That exchange had clearly marked the beginning of hostilities. Now, this letter. It wasn't just the fine, it was the principle. It was the arrogance of a man prioritizing pristine lawns over potential lives. Lily and Tom came bursting out of the back door, their school day over, their laughter a stark contrast to the turmoil in Grace's chest. "Mom, "Can we go to the park?" Lily asked, her backpack already discarded on the patio. Tom, ever observant, noticed the letter. "What's wrong, Mom?" Grace forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetie. Just some neighborhood business." She wouldn't burden them, not yet. But as she watched them chase a rogue butterfly across the lawn, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her family anymore. The shelter was built to accommodate at least 20 people. Her immediate neighbors, the Changs with their elderly mother, and the Washingtons with their newborn, had all expressed quiet relief and gratitude when she'd undertaken the project. They'd offered hushed words of encouragement, wary of Hart's ever-watchful eyes. The problem had officially begun the moment her permit application for a below-ground storage unit, a deliberately vague but not untruthful description, had been cross-referenced by a zealous HOA committee member with a penchant for scrutinizing county records. Hart had pounced. He'd called an emergency HOA board meeting, conveniently when Grace was out of town for a brief engineering consultation. The board, mostly composed of retirees swayed by Hart's domineering personality and dire warnings of plummeting property values, had rubber-stamped his motion to deny retroactive approval for the unauthorized structure. The fine was the first shot across the bow. Grace knew Hart. He wouldn't stop there. He'd leverage every clause in the CC&Rs, rally his supporters, and paint her as a rogue homeowner threatening their tranquil, meticulously controlled existence. That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace sat at her kitchen table, the threatening letter lying beside a fresh cup of coffee. The silence of the house was a poor cloak for the storm brewing in her mind. She thought of Mark, of his quiet strength, his belief in her. He would have told her to fight. He would have been down in that hole with her, mixing concrete and checking levels. She pulled out a copy of the Palm Point CC&Rs, a document so dense it could cure insomnia. She was looking for loopholes, for ambiguities, but Hart and his predecessors had crafted it well. Yet, there had to be something. Florida law, perhaps. While HOAs had significant power, they weren't omnipotent, and surely safety, especially in a hurricane-prone state like Florida, had to count for something. The local news droned on the small television in the corner, a meteorologist pointing to a swirl of clouds brewing far out in the Atlantic. Early days yet, folks, but this system bears watching. Conditions are favorable for development. Grace looked from the screen to the letter. A new wave of determination washed over her. This wasn't just about an aesthetic harmony dispute with Douglas Hart. This was about survival, about foresight, about a mother's fierce need to protect her own and her community. Hart wanted the shelter gone. She would ensure it was ready. The true test wouldn't be in an HOA meeting room, but when the wind and water came calling, and Grace intended to be prepared, not just with concrete and steel, but with every ounce of her engineering skill in a mother's unwavering resolve. The battle for the backyard bunker had just begun. The fight, however, was taking its toll. Whispers followed her when she did the school run. Sidelong glances from neighbors who had once been friendly now held a mixture of pity and disapproval. Hart had been busy, poisoning the well, framing her as a stubborn troublemaker. The Palm Point online forum, usually a place for lost cat announcements and recommendations for plumbers, was now a battleground of thinly veiled accusations and outright condemnations of her eyesore and reckless disregard for community standards. One evening, Henderson from across the street, a woman whose prize-winning roses were her pride and joy, cornered Grace by her mailbox. "Grace, dear," she began, her voice laced with a forced sympathy. "Douglas is just trying to protect our property values. We all have to abide by the rules. Perhaps if you just filled it in for the sake of neighborhood peace?" Grace bit back a sharp retort. "And what about our peace of mind when a hurricane is barreling down on us? Eleanor, will property values matter when homes are flattened, Mrs.?" Henderson just shook her head, retreating to her perfectly manicured lawn. "He's a very determined man, Grace, a very influential one." The veiled threat hung in the air. Grace knew it. Hart wasn't just the HOA president, he had connections. He golfed with councilmen, hosted fundraisers. He could make things difficult for her, professionally even, if he chose to. The thought sent a sliver of fear through her, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger. She wouldn't be bullied. She was a professional, a taxpayer, a responsible citizen doing what she felt was necessary in a region that lived under the constant shadow of the storm. She decided to consult a lawyer, someone specializing in HOA disputes. The initial consultation was sobering. HOA governing documents are notoriously powerful in Florida. Mr. Davies, a lawyer with weary eyes and an office overflowing with files, explained, aesthetic considerations, however subjective, are often upheld if the CC&Rs are vaguely worded enough to grant the board broad discretion. Your best bet might be to appeal to the board, present a case for necessity, perhaps gather support from other residents. Gathering support, that was the challenge when Hart had already painted her as the villain. Still, she had to try. She also started documenting everything, every letter, every veiled threat, every online comment. If this escalated, she needed to be ready. The fight for the shelter was becoming a fight for her reputation, her peace, and ultimately, the safety of those she cared about. The daily $100 fines began to accumulate with relentless precision. Each notice slipped into her mailbox, a fresh stab of anxiety. Grace's attempt to formally appeal to the HOA board was met with a curt, dismissive letter, reiterating their previous decision and citing Hart's comprehensive report on the matter. The report, she later discovered through a sympathetic, albeit timid, board member, was filled with exaggerations about structural instability, utterly false. Her engineering calculations were meticulous, and misrepresentations of neighbor complaints, painting a picture of widespread outrage that Grace knew was skewed. Only a handful, Hart's closest allies, were truly against it. Most were simply intimidated into silence. Her legal consultations with Mr. Davies yielded little immediate hope. We can file a petition for mediation, then potentially a lawsuit, he'd advised. But it's costly and time-consuming. And in the meantime, the fines accrue. Hart knows this. He's banking on wearing you down, and he was right. The financial strain was becoming a heavy cloak. Mark's life insurance had been meant for the children's future, for college, not to be bled dry by a vindictive HOA president. Grace started taking on extra freelance drafting work, late nights spent hunched over her computer after Lily and Tom were in bed, the glow of the screen illuminating her tired face. The kids noticed. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Tom asked one evening, his small hand on her arm. "You look bomb." Grace hugged him fiercely, assuring him everything was fine, but the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The impact on her children was the hardest part. Lily came home from school one day, tears welling in her eyes. "Sarah said her dad said you're breaking the rules and making our street look ugly." Sarah was Mr. Henderson's granddaughter. Grace's heart ached. She sat Lily down, explaining in simple terms why she'd built the shelter, why it was important to be prepared, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant facing opposition. Lily, with a child's innate sense of fairness, seemed to understand, but the incident left Grace seething at Hart's campaign of whispers that now reached even the schoolyard. She tried to rally direct support from her immediate neighbors, the Changs, whose elderly mother suffered from severe respiratory issues exacerbated by stress, were privately terrified of hurricane season. Mr. Chang would nod in agreement when Grace spoke of the shelter's necessity, his eyes darting nervously towards Hart's house down the street. "We are with you, Grace, in spirit," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Mr. Hart, he can make things difficult for everyone." The Washingtons, young parents of a colicky newborn, were equally torn, expressing their gratitude for the shelter's existence, but fearful of HOA retaliation if they publicly supported her. Their fear was a palpable barrier. One sweltering July afternoon, as Grace was meticulously checking the shelter's sump pump, a new figure appeared at her property line. It was Mayor Lenny Shue, a man known for his proactive community engagement and a generally well-liked figure in Fort Myers. He was younger than Hart, with a keen, intelligent gaze and a reputation for being a problem solver. Grace felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps someone in a position of real authority would see reason. "Mrs. Holloway?" Mayor Shu extended a hand. "Lenny Shu, I've been hearing rumbles about a dispute down here in Palm Point and something about an innovative private storm shelter." Grace, wiping grease from her hands, explained the situation, her voice passionate but controlled. She showed him the shelter, the reinforced hatch, the surprisingly spacious interior, the emergency supplies neatly stacked. She laid out her rationale, the safety concerns, the increasing intensity of storms. Mayor Shu listened intently, asking pertinent questions about capacity, ventilation, and compliance with safety codes. He seemed impressed by the engineering and her foresight. "This is quite something, Miss Holloway. A lot of thought and effort has gone into this." He frowned. "And the HOA is fining you for it?" "For aesthetic disharmony and being an unauthorized structure," Grace confirmed, the bitterness evident. "Mr. Hart is determined to have it removed." The mayor nodded slowly. "Douglas Hart. Yes, I know him. He's zealous about his community's image." He looked around. "Frankly, from here, I can barely tell anything is out of the ordinary. The landscaping is quite effective." He paused. "Let me see what I can do. I can't directly intervene in HOA matters. They are private agreements, but perhaps a conversation, an appeal to common sense, might be in order, especially with hurricane season well and truly upon us." A tropical depression, then named Tropical Storm Danielle, was indeed churning in the Gulf, its projected path still uncertain, but a stark reminder of the ever-present threat. The news was filled with images of boarded-up windows in coastal towns further west. Mayor Shu's intervention, however, proved to be the twist Grace hadn't anticipated, and not in the way she'd hoped. A week later, Hart called an emergency HOA meeting, not at the usual clubhouse, but pointedly, on the sidewalk directly across from Grace's house. He stood before a small crowd of residents, his voice amplified by a small megaphone. "It has come to my attention," Hart declared, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers and lingering on Grace, who watched from her porch, "that certain outside influences are attempting to undermine the authority and autonomy of our Palm Point Homeowners Association." He didn't name Mayor Shu, but the implication was clear. This is not just about one unauthorized, unsightly bunker anymore. This is about our right to self-govern, to maintain the standards we all agreed to when we bought into this community. Are we to let one individual, aided by political figures with their own agendas, dictate how we live and what our neighborhood looks like? He was good. He was a demagogue, twisting the narrative, playing on people's fears of losing control, of their property values being decided by outsiders. He painted Grace not just as a rule breaker, but as a Trojan horse for unwanted external interference. Several of Hart's staunchest supporters nodded vehemently. Even some of the previously neutral faces in the crowd seemed swayed by his rhetoric. The escalation was clear. Hart wasn't just fighting her, he was now framing it as a fight for Palm Point's soul, with Grace as the antagonist. The fines continued, the pressure mounted, and Tropical Storm Danielle was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane, its cone of probability slowly inching closer to southwest Florida. The wind, it seemed, was picking up in more ways than one. Grace felt more isolated than ever, but the sight of Danielle on the weather maps only solidified her resolve. The shelter wasn't an option, it was a necessity. The real storm was coming, and Douglas Hart's aesthetic concerns were about to meet a far more powerful force. Hurricane Danielle was no longer a distant swirl on a weather map. It was a menacing Category 2, then a 3, churning a direct path towards southwest Florida. Fort Myers, once on the edge of the cone of uncertainty, now lay squarely in its bullseye. The language of the meteorologists shifted from cautionary to urgent. Evacuation orders for coastal and low-lying areas began to roll out. Palm Point wasn't under a mandatory evacuation yet, but the tension was a thick, suffocating blanket. Hart's sidewalk rally had, perversely, galvanized Grace. His attempt to paint her as an enemy of the community had backfired in her mind, solidifying her belief that his leadership was not just misguided, but dangerous. While he postured about neighborhood aesthetics and self-governance, she was tracking wind speeds and rainfall predictions. The fines continued to arrive, now mockingly tucked into her mailbox alongside urgent storm preparedness flyers from the county. She ignored them. The money, the threats, they felt distant, trivial, compared to the atmospheric fury coalescing in the Gulf. Her resistance took the form of quiet, relentless preparation. She triple-checked the shelter's seals, tested the generator and the backup battery systems, inventoried her supplies, water, food, first aid, radios, ensuring she had enough not just for her family but for the neighbors she still hoped would join them. She shared her personal preparedness checklist on a neighborhood social media group, carefully avoiding any mention of her shelter, focusing instead on general safety tips. It was a subtle act of defiance, offering expertise where Hart offered only rhetoric. Some thanked her, others, Hart's vocal supporters, accused her of fear-mongering. Mayor Hsu, true to his word about not being able to directly intervene, found other ways to make his stance known. He initiated a citywide campaign encouraging residents to make a plan, build a kit, stay informed, and help your neighbor. He publicly praised citizens who took proactive steps for community resilience, a thinly veiled nod to initiatives like Grace's. During a press conference, when asked about private shelters, he stated, "Any structure that meets Florida Building House and FEMA safety guidelines and can protect our residents is a welcome asset in a storm. Bureaucracy should not stand in the way of safety." Hart, Grace heard, was furious at the mayor's comments, seeing them as a direct challenge to his HOA authority. The shift in power began subtly, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in furtive knocks on Grace's door under the cover of the increasingly gloomy pre-hurricane sky. Mrs. Henderson, who had previously urged Grace to fill in the shelter, appeared one evening, her face etched with worry. "Grace," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her usual haughtiness replaced by a raw fear. "The news, it looks very bad. That place you built, is it truly safe?" Grace, seeing not an adversary but a frightened neighbor, simply nodded. "It's as safe as I could make it. Eleanor, reinforced concrete, built to withstand a Category 5. Would there be room?" The question hung in the air, a quiet surrender of pride. "Yes," Grace said gently. "For you and Mr. Henderson, if you need it." Eleanor Henderson didn't commit, but the crack in Hart's wall of united opposition was showing. Others followed. Young Mr. Peterson, one of Hart's most vocal online cheerleaders, messaged her privately. "Hypothetically, if things get really hairy, what's the capacity of that thing?" Even a board member, one who had voted against her, called with a hypothetical question about shelter ventilation systems for his own home safe room, a conversation that Grace knew was a veiled inquiry about her shelter. Douglas Hart, however, doubled down. As Danielle intensified to a Category 4, a terrifying monster of a storm, he issued an official HOA communique. It was a masterpiece of obtuse bureaucracy and veiled threats. All residents are reminded that Palm Point's CCNRs regarding unauthorized structures remain in full effect. The association will not be liable for any incidents arising from the use of non-sanctioned, uninspected private facilities. Official county shelters are the only approved option for those evacuating. He even had no trespassing HOA order signs printed and was rumored to be planning to post them around Grace's property line, though the escalating winds made such an endeavor increasingly impractical. The hidden truth that began to emerge was not a scandalous secret about Hart, but a revelation about his character in the face of genuine crisis. While Grace was focused on communal safety, Hart seemed obsessed with control and the letter of the HOA law. Even as a potential catastrophe loomed, His own storm preparations were rumored to be minimal. He was reportedly telling people he would ride it out in his standard construction home, a testament, he claimed, to the quality of Palm Point building. Or perhaps, Grace thought, a testament to his own arrogance. The day before Danielle was predicted to make landfall, the sky was an ominous, bruised purple. Rain came in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled with a mournful, rising intensity. Mandatory evacuation orders now covered their zone. Most of Palm Point was either gone or hunkered down. Grace made the final checks on her shelter. The hatch was heavy, but she and Lily, working together, could manage it. Tom, bless his resilient heart, was in charge of entertainment, a backpack filled with books and card games. Then came a development that felt like a punch. A county sheriff's deputy, looking apologetic and harried, arrived at her door. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we've had a complaint from your HOA president, Mr. Hart. He's alleging you're operating an unlicensed public shelter and creating a public nuisance by encouraging people to ignore evacuation orders to official shelters." Grace was stunned. "Encouraging? I've told everyone to make their own best decision. This is for my family and immediate neighbors who choose it. This is a private shelter on private property." "I understand, ma'am," the deputy said, clearly uncomfortable. "And frankly, with what's coming, we have bigger fish to fry, Bishem." But he filed a formal complaint, and he's citing safety concerns if it's not up to code, which is ironic. "I hear, my captain just said to assess, advise you of the complaint, and make sure you're not, forcing anyone in there or charging money." Grace assured him it was voluntary, free, and built beyond any code Hart could dream of. The deputy, after a cursory glance at her engineering plans, which she readily provided, and seeing the terrified faces of the Changs and the Washingtons who had already decided to join her, just sighed. "Looks more solid than my own house. You all stay safe." He tipped his hat and left. Battling the wind back to his cruiser, Hart's complaint was a desperate, vindictive act, and it backfired spectacularly. Word of it, and the deputy's dismissive reaction, spread quickly via text messages among the remaining residents. If anyone had still doubted Hart's petty tyranny over genuine concern, this incident clarified it. The power dynamic was shifting, not through meetings or votes, but through the primal fear of the storm and the dawning realization of who was truly prepared to help. As dusk fell, painting the raging sky in even more terrifying hues, Grace stood by the shelter hatch. Her children were already below, along with the Changs and the Washingtons. Ella Lisnor and George Henderson arrived, carrying a small bag, their faces pale but resolute. "Thank you, Grace," George mumbled, the wind snatching his words. More followed, not a flood, but a trickle of frightened families. Some who had openly criticized her now sought the safety of her eyesore. Each arrival was a small victory against Hart's obstinacy, a testament to the power of shared vulnerability over rigid rules. The ground beneath Palm Point was about to be tested, and so was the character of its residents. Grace's shelter was ready. The community, fractured and scared, was slowly, hesitantly, coming together in the face of a power far greater than any HOA. The world outside the reinforced concrete hatch became a symphony of shrieking chaos. Hurricane Danielle made landfall with the savage fury of a mythical beast. Its winds, now gusting well over 140 miles per hour, tearing at everything in their path. Inside Grace's shelter, 23 souls huddled together, the dim emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows on their anxious faces. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, ozone, and fear. Every so often, a deafening crash from above would punctuate the roar of the wind, trees surrendering, debris slamming into what remained of houses, the terrifying unknown impacts on Grace's own home directly overhead. Lily and Tom, remarkably brave, were nestled close to Grace. Tom clutched his entertainment backpack, though no one was in the mood for games. Lily, pale but composed, helped Grace distribute water and offer quiet reassurance to the younger Washington child, who whimpered fitfully. Mrs. Chang's breathing was labored, but her son monitored her with a pulse oximeter, his face a mask of gratitude towards Grace. Even Eleanor Henderson, stripped of her usual imperiousness, sat quietly, her hand gripping her husband's. They were a microcosm of a community thrown together by disaster. Their previous squabbles and social standings rendered meaningless by the existential threat raging just inches above their heads. Grace moved among them, a calm center in the claustrophobic space. She checked the air vents, monitored the battery levels of the comms radio, crackling with increasingly dire official broadcasts, and offered words of encouragement. Her engineering mind cataloged the sounds, trying to differentiate between the general roar and specific impacts. Each thud directly above was a fresh wave of anxiety for her own home, but her primary concern was the integrity of the shelter and the safety of the people within it. There was no aesthetic harmony here, only the raw, desperate harmony of survival. Hours passed in a blur of escalating wind noise and stomach-churning pressure changes. At one point, a particularly violent tremor shook the shelter, accompanied by a sound like a freight train derailing on the roof. The lights flickered ominously. A collective gasp went through the occupants. Grace held her breath, waiting for the telltale groan of stressed concrete or the drip of incoming water. Nothing. The shelter, her design, her labor, held. Douglas Hart, meanwhile, was learning a brutal lesson in the physics of wind and load and the inadequacy of HOA bravado against a Category 4 hurricane. He had indeed chosen to ride it out alone in his meticulously maintained home, perhaps imagining a post-storm scene where he could critique the less fortunate. The reality was far different. His picture window, the one offering a perfect view of his prized HOA-compliant lawn, had been among the first things to implode, showering his living room with glass and wind-driven rain. His roof began to peel away section by section. The storm surge, higher than predicted in their slightly inland area, lapped at his doorstep, then invaded his home, turning his perfectly ordered life into a terrifying, waterlogged chaos. His phone was dead, the power long gone. There were no committees to appeal to, no CCNRs to invoke against the screaming wind. There was only the humbling, terrifying power of nature he had so arrogantly dismissed. As dawn approached, the hurricane's ferocity began to wane, its eye wall having passed. The wind, though still strong and no longer shrieked with the same maniacal intensity. The rain softened to a steady, heavy downpour. After what felt like an eternity, Grace, listening intently, declared it might be safe enough for a quick look. With Mr. Chang and Mr. Washington helping, she unbarred and slowly pushed open the heavy hatch. The scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. Palm Point was almost unrecognizable. Majestic oaks were uprooted, their massive root balls pointing accusingly at the sky. Houses were battered, roofs gone, walls collapsed. Cars were strewn about like discarded toys. A mournful silence, broken only by the drip of water and the distant wail of emergency sirens, had replaced the storm's roar. Grace's own house above the shelter had suffered significant damage. A large portion of the roof was missing, and a massive pine tree had crashed into the garage. But the shelter itself, its entrance now a small island of solidity in a sea of wreckage, was untouched. One by one, the occupants emerged, blinking in the gray morning light, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and profound gratitude. Mrs. Henderson surveyed the obliterated landscape, then turned to Grace, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us. Grace, you truly saved us all." There were no more discussions of property values, only the dawning realization of how close they had come to something far worse. The children, wide-eyed, clung to their parents. Word of the Palm Point bunker and its occupants spread like wildfire through the recovering city in the days that followed. Rescue teams, navigating the debris-choked streets, were astonished to find a pocket of survivors not just safe, but relatively comfortable and accounted for. The story of the stubborn engineer who defied her HOA to build a life-saving shelter became a beacon of hope and resilience. Mayor Lenny Xu arrived a day later, his face grim from touring the widespread destruction, but it lit up when he saw Grace in the small community she had fostered. He hugged her. "Grace, your foresight, it's incredible. You didn't just save these families, you've shown this whole city what preparedness truly means." He looked at the shelter, then at the grateful faces around her. This isn't an unauthorized structure. This is a testament to ingenuity and community spirit. Douglas Hart was found by a search and rescue team, dazed and hypothermic, in the flooded ruins of his home. His prized roses were gone, his manicured lawn a muddy wasteland. His physical ordeal was matched by the utter ruin of his reputation. When the story of his last-minute vindictive complaint to the sheriff emerged, contrasted with Grace's quiet heroism, public opinion was swift and brutal. The Palm Point HOA Facebook page, once his echo chamber, was flooded with angry comments demanding his resignation. Other board members, witnessing firsthand the shelter's success and Hart's catastrophic misjudgment, quickly distanced themselves from him. The fines against Grace were not just dropped, they became a symbol of the HOA's previous folly. In the weeks that followed, Mayor Xu championed Grace's cause. He publicly lauded her efforts and used her shelter as an example in pushing for streamlined city and county regulations to encourage the construction of private and community storm shelters, ensuring that safety, not arbitrary aesthetic rules, became the priority. He announced a new initiative, Fort Myers Stronger, aimed at enhancing community resilience, with Grace Holloway invited to be a key advisor. Grace, though hailed as a hero, remained grounded. Her focus was on rebuilding her own damaged home, helping her children process the trauma, and supporting her neighbors as they all began the arduous task of recovery. The shelter, now a local landmark, was cleaned, restocked, and officially designated by the city as a registered community safe room, the first of many they hoped to encourage. The battle with Douglas Hart was over, not won in a courtroom or an HOA meeting, but in the crucible of the storm. He quietly resigned from the HOA presidency and reportedly moved away from Fort Myers. His legacy, one of petty tyranny eclipsed by nature's might and one woman's quiet courage. Grace never sought accolades, but she found a deeper satisfaction in the renewed sense of community in Palm Point. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing resources and labor, the shared trauma forging new bonds. Her children, though they had been through a terrifying ordeal, had also witnessed their mother's strength and the power of preparedness. As Fort Myers slowly healed, the story of Grace Holloway and her backyard bunker served as a powerful reminder that true harmony isn't found in an unblemished landscape, but in the resilience of the human spirit and the courage to protect one another when the winds of adversity blow their fiercest. Grace's battle for her community shelter, against all odds in a stubborn HOA, proves courage and foresight can triumph. When disaster struck, her vision saved lives, shaming her detractors and inspiring a city. Thank you for watching this incredible story of resilience. If you were moved, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done?